KPBS On Demand is supported by Paint Care, offering households and businesses in California more than 800 leftover paint drop-off sites for recycling. Quantities of 100-plus gallons of paint may qualify for a large volume pickup. Learn more at paintcare.org.
Welcome back to another edition of listener-supported KPBS Cinema Junkie podcast. I'm Beth Accomando. And today, we're having what is usually an annual checkup with the Doctor of the Dead, one of my favorite people, Arnold Blumberg, and there's a reason specifically to talk to him today because he has a new book out. And I just want to say that just like with zombie films, every time a new one that comes out, I always think like, are they going to be able to find something new and fresh so that when I go see this film, it's going to make me feel like it was worth going to? And when you said you had another book on the zombies and the undead, I was thinking like, wow, you've already written quite a few books. How is he going to find something new to uncover? And you did. So this was really fun. So for people who may not be familiar with stuff, tell us the books you've written before and what your new one is.
Well, first of all, thank you so much. And it's always a joy to talk with you again. So, and I love hearing that. I'm glad that worked for you. Going back to the beginning of it all, what started the whole Doctor of the Dead journey was the fact that I started teaching a course in zombies and popular media at the University of Baltimore. The first time was back in 2010. And that was because I had co-authored one of the very first guidebooks to zombie cinema in 2006, and that was called Zombie Mania. It was actually called Zombie Mania, 80 Movies to Die For, but we cataloged like about 570 movies in there, and I often find that when I do the full title, everybody thinks the book only had 80 movies in it, so I just say Zombie Mania. But I did that. I contributed to a lot of other books and chapters through several other books, and between that and the course, just started building this public persona as like one of the so-called zombie scholars and experts out there that would talk about it in a variety of different media venues. And it just seemed to grow. I eventually did a podcast, which I'm still doing, the Doctor of the Dead podcast. You can find on iTunes and Stitcher, all kind of places. And now it's led me to writing this book, which to me is very much the culmination of everything I've been working on since the first one back in 2006.
Before we start talking about the book, I wanted to talk a little bit about your teaching of zombies. You also use Marvel Universe to teach classes. But talk a little bit about the fact that it's not really a class on zombies in the sense of you're teaching about zombies. It's you're using zombies to kind of get to students, to get their brains to kind of be firing off a little more. And describe what that, kind of like what the impetus was for you to turn to zombies for this.
Well, first of all, you described that exactly right. I mean, that's it. The whole idea is there are a lot of people out there, including a lot of people you're never going to be able to convince because their minds are already closed, that this idea that somehow using pop culture and entertainment in an academic setting is somehow wasting their time or wasting students' time or a horrible thing to do, when really the whole point is everything I've done my whole academic career is about media literacy and critical thinking. And it's this idea that every piece of media, all the entertainment we surround ourselves with, often very passively, you sit in a room, you leave the TV on, it's background noise, all of this stuff contains messages. Very often specifically shaped messages with an agenda, and they're conveyed through metaphor and through allegory and symbolism. And even if you're one of those people who thinks, well, it's just a thing, it's just escapism, you're getting the meaning whether you realize it or not. The goal is to get kids, and unfortunately in this country we don't start this soon enough, but to get kids to realize that if they want to enjoy something they can, but they can also look at something and derive meaning from it and see how all these things we enjoy are also part of an ongoing cultural conversation about who we are as people. So yes, you use zombies, you use Marvel Cinematic Universe, which I did a course in. I taught a comic book literature course for about 15 years. And the goal is that's just the framework. You're using something that gets students a bit more excited and engaged than maybe the kind of stuff you would normally hand them in a class. But then you can get them to start talking about race, gender, economic divisions, the ecology and the environment, every deep and important, meaningful conversation that can be had about our culture, you can get to that point with students through pop culture. And the zombie is particularly good for that. And my start was, I had always seemed to gravitate toward academics in one way or another. I started teaching, it's almost 20 years ago now. And the first stuff I taught was a course I created in comic book literature when my alma mater said, we'd like to have you come back and teach in the English department. What would you like to teach? And I said, I don't want to just teach survey courses. That seems boring. I'd like to create something. And at the time, there weren't many courses in comics that weren't just in an art department that looked at it as literature. So I did that, and then over the years saw that grow to many other universities and really being treated more seriously. And then I branched out into many of the other things I loved, and that eventually led to me pitching the University of Baltimore on the idea of a semester in zombies and using that as the metaphor we would explore. And it took about 20 minutes of convincing the department head. And then he saw it and he was like, yeah, I get it. And he said, this sounds like a good idea. And off we went.
And what do you think it is about zombies that makes them particularly good for this particular kind of class?
Well, the simplest answer is the old cliche about the modern zombie movie, which is we are them and they are us. It's just that when it comes right down to it, out of sort of the whole pantheon of fantasy creatures you can pick out, the zombie is the closest to us that you can get. They're a carnival mirror reflection of us. They are us sometimes. You can do zombie stories from the point of view of the zombie or from the point of view of somebody who is transforming. They're your family. They're your friends. And so since they are, in essence, a monster and yet simultaneously a victim and also us, they are this perfect humanoid form to pour in any meaning that you want, and particularly anything we're afraid of at any given point in history. The zombie can serve as a reflection of that. And so even if you just look at movies, going back to the 30s and up to the present, you can map the state of American culture and the mindset through what is happening in a zombie movie. And like I said, the point for this is get students in a room that might be reticent to really start talking about important things, like the fact that our country still struggles with race and gender issues and hasn't learned a lot about any of this. And instead of giving them a heavy text or something much more on point, you go at it from the side. You give them a zombie story that symbolizes all that. And then soon enough, you have a dynamic conversation in class about all those things.
All right. I totally agree with you in terms of zombies being this great blank slate. But to play devil's advocate a bit, because people do still ask me, like, why are people so obsessed with zombies? Why is this something that continues to hold people's interest? So vampires are also undead, different kind of undead. But why aren't they, why don't they capture our imagination in the same way that these zombies do?
It's an excellent question. I get the feeling that there are probably vampire scholars out there who might be slightly more steeped in that side of things to provide a healthy debate about it with me. But, I mean, obviously, like everyone else, I grew up loving vampire stories like all the others. So, I mean, I guess if I had to try to quantify it, I would say there are certain things about the way the vampire is usually used in storytelling that limits the ability of that creature to be as useful or as universal as the zombie. And that's because the more specific you start to get about the traits and the physicality and the factors involved in that particular creature, the more you start to limit the possibilities. And that's not to say that there aren't a wide range of vampire stories, everything from stories where the creatures are the kind of loathsome, disgusting monsters that go back to folklore to, of course, the romantic ideal that we've really crafted in the modern era. There are a lot of possibilities. But I would still say that vampires fit often into certain basic categories. They're an exploration of sexuality. They're an exploration of disease. There are certain things that I just feel narrow that scope. And there's also that sense of universality that I said before, that the zombie represents us. Vampires can come across, in a certain respect, as more alien. as they are more a creature unto themselves, it's often less about the fact that it's a human being who's become one as it is about the vampire versus humanity. And again, there are stories that explore many different ways of doing that, but I still feel that ultimately vampires are a little more limited, and the zombie is just this perfect generic vessel that can represent everything from disease to death itself to any given fear. And there's a lot to be said for the fact that many of the creatures I classify as zombies, though, many other people would look at and say, well, those are really vampires, and that's because there are a lot of characters in some of these movies that kind of straddle that line, and they're hybrids. They're the zompires of the genre.
Well, your new book takes kind of a historic approach kind of to zombies, kind of putting them into a context, not just giving us a list of films or suggesting which ones are the best ones to watch, but it kind of gives us this history of them. And one of the things I love is that you begin with the voodoo zombie, which I think tends to get forgotten because George Romero so brilliantly reinvented them in the 1960s for his Night of the Living Dead. But before that, in literature and in film, we had these voodoo zombies. So tell us what a voodoo zombie is and how kind of those origins first, made their cinematic appearances, because they go back to the silent films.
Yeah, one of the things that I did, well, first of all, again, thanks I'm so glad you enjoyed it. In Zombie Mania, when my co-author Andy Hirschberger and I did Zombie Mania, our goal was to do the kind of guidebook that we both love to leave on a coffee table and that you could delve into anytime you saw a favorite film and look up that film and find out everything about it, including our take on it. And this was a very different thing. This was instead meant to be, as you say, a sort of putting this all into context in a variety of ways, culturally, historically, and looking at this timeline. And it does go back to silent film. There are some prototypical figures in early horror cinema that are not zombies per se, but given all the permutations that come later, we can now look back and realize, well, there were elements that were in play. But as you point out correctly, the zombie as a pop culture figure derives largely from the cultural appropriation of the zombie tradition, the voodoo tradition, from Haiti and from West Indies. And all that began, at least pop culturally anyway, all that began with people like, for instance, one of the key names is William Seabrook, who was this sort of all-around Indiana Jones anthropologist and sociologist and potentially lunatic as well, who went to the West Indies and came back and wrote this book, The Magic Island, in 1929. And it was all about his journey there and all the strange and primitive things he discovered. And, of course, he's looking at this culture through the lens of someone from a very different background. And in 12 pages in that book, he details meeting a zombie and learning about the tradition of zombies in which, according to their cultural tradition, a zombie is potentially a dead person who's come back to life or a person who is infused with the spirits of the dead or even channeling the spirit of a god. And there are a wide variety of different aspects of this. There's also the idea that zombie is often referred to as the captured spirit of a dead person in a vessel, which can also be like a jar. And there are different versions of the word from a variety of different languages. But all of this was quickly appropriated by the Western white entertainment machine when people started reading stuff from people like Seabrook or Zora Neale Hurston and a variety of other people saying, did you realize there are all these strange primitive people down there who are practicing this weird hybrid of their own traditions and Catholicism because of missionaries that had visited them? And the result was now we see this idea that somewhere there are these dark, mysterious figures, these priests who are speaking horrific rites and either enslaving living beings and turning them into hypnotized automatons or actually raising the dead. And Hollywood immediately was like, well, we got to get in on that. And the result was the first pop culture zombies were a seriously distorted interpretation of these very real Haitian traditions, which are very deeply embedded in their culture.
And part of these voodoo zombies, part of what infused them with their meaning was these were cultures, Haiti, and also some of it comes from Africa, is this notion of slavery and this sense of no longer being in control of your own body and your own being. And that really gave a lot of kind of weight and symbolism to those kind of voodoo zombies in early literature and film.
Absolutely. And in fact, it's like, I think today we're having so many more conversations. Sometimes they're pretty fraught because of the, I think, extreme rise in toxicity as people who are on the other side of the equation feel even more emboldened to express their hatred. But we're having more open conversations about just how much our culture has fed off, appropriately enough for zombies, other cultures and other histories. And there's a tragic quality to the pop culture zombie in that the original conception of that, yes, does reflect sort of a culture's understanding of its own inherent loss of agency and the scourge of slavery that doesn't define them as people, but horribly distorted their lives and their countries. And the zombie in that early form is sort of this perfect embodiment, as you say, of a loss of free will, a loss of individuality, a loss of control of your destiny. One of my favorite early scenes of the earliest zombie movie ever, White Zombie in 1932, is this scene with no dialogue, but just like the crushing sound of the gears of this mill that all these zombies are working in. And as the camera slowly pans across, one of them falls into the workings of the mill, and they all just keep marching and grinding on. And it's just this perfect metaphor for the Western world is just churning up and destroying these people, and they have no regard for them as humans whatsoever. That's where this all starts from.
How do your classes react when you bring up some of these early zombie films? Because I'm sure they're probably familiar with things like Zombieland or Walking Dead, but are they as familiar with these voodoo zombie films?
No, not at all. And I usually, it's gotten more and more, it's gotten more and more difficult as a fan, as a pop culture fan, to face the reality of getting older and having rooms of, by contrast in terms of the distance between us, younger and younger groups. I mean, they're the same age, but the distance is greater every year. Of kids that it will openly tell me, not with like any sense of disappointment or sadness, but just as a fact that they've never seen a black and white movie in their life and never had any reason to or desire to. So in many cases, I'm the first person that's ever made them see anything. I mean, in some cases pre-1970 certainly, but anything black and white. And I joke about it, like, for instance, White Zombie runs about 60, 70 minutes. And so one of my first jokes about it is I tell them, this is only going to be an hour, but it's going to feel like 2. And because they're not used to the pacing. And even I feel the difference these days, how different our storytelling pacing has become. But I do often find that once they get past all the things that they find alien, the black and white, the stilted sound and dialogue and acting, all the things that, granted, are silly from a modern perspective, it's fascinating and it's very heartening how they still manage to get shocked by things or inspired to write about them and have a conversation. So it just shows it still works. You just got to give it to them in the proper context.
Well, thank God there are people like you still doing that then.
Thank you. I'll do my best. By the way, I hit a milestone this year. This is the first time this semester. Every semester now I've been using Night of the Living Dead in the writing classes I've been teaching. And I always ask the kids before we get to the week when we watch it, have you ever seen it before? And a few hands always go up in a room of about 20. This is the first time in my teaching career I asked them if anybody's seen it before. No hands went up.
Oh, my God.
Yeah. So this is my first time ever. I'm teaching at least one section of one of my classes that had never encountered this movie before in their lives. And it's a first. But I don't think it'll be the last time, surely. But that's fine because, like I said, great. In a way, I almost appreciate that. Let them come to this fresh in the context of our class and then see what happens.
Well, I want to thank you because in your chapter on these early zombies, what you call proto-zombies, you have some images from a film called J'accuse, which I have to admit I have never seen. And those images were magnificent. And I'm going like, I have to dig this film up. I don't I don't know why I've missed it.
Oh, I'm so glad. I was really fascinated by that. That came about like after the first book, Zombie Mania, after the class. I started building up what I could take as a traveling lecture of just the history of zombie cinema, and I started adding things to the front of it to really set the historical basis with this idea of prototypical zombies. When I discovered J'accuse, one of the first things I found, this was years ago, one of the first things I found was that picture in the book of the skull-faced World War I soldiers coming back. And I saw, everywhere I saw that picture, I saw J'accuse, 1919. And I thought, wow, this is very impressive. And I had been using that. And then it was only in the last couple of years that I did some more research in preparation for this book. And I saw that a lot more people out there had really started to fill in the gaps in the story of this film and were explaining that, no, actually that picture was from a 1938 remake of the movie and that they don't appear that way in 1919, but it added another dimension to this whole thing. And it just fascinated me, too, how things have changed so much in only the last few years in terms of how much we know about even media that goes back nearly a century. There's so much more out there now than there was even a few years ago, but it also means you always have to be learning and checking because you never know, your conception might be wrong. And I find the whole J'accuse thing a really interesting way to open it up.
Well, and in this chapter on proto-zombies that you have, you also mention a zombie who's not quite in any of those categories exactly, which is the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari.
Oh, sure, yes. Caesar is Conrad Veidt, who a lot of people might remember from Casablanca, among other things, but as a sleepwalker, he represents a lot of the things that we will then come to accept visually, and in some ways thematically, as a zombie figure, because he's a slave to a master, he does his bidding, he has no free will, and he stalks, stiff-limbed, and is basically a puppet. And so there are all these elements that are what we will one day call a zombie in certain contexts, although there wasn't that connection at the point that was done. But then it's also considered one of the greatest early horror movies ever made. So it demonstrates that naturally that idea was in people's heads as we move forward in time and start to develop this concept. That figure is certainly a part of that history.
I really like focusing on these early zombies and early zombie films because I think people are getting a lot of stuff about Romero, especially since he passed away recently, and there's been a focus on his work. So I really enjoy talking to you about some of these early films. Are there any other films in this proto-zombie chapter that you'd like to highlight for us?
One does come to mind, and I've still never seen a complete, I think you can find a complete version of it on archive.org, but I haven't gotten a chance to see the whole thing, but it's the French film that's sometimes called The Crazy Ray. Danny Boyle spoke about that movie when talking about his inspirations for 28 Days Later and said that was one of his direct inspirations visually for what eventually comes to be known on the side of the zombie genre, sort of in the larger apocalyptic genre as the empty city film. And we see so many of those, not just zombie movies, but The Road, and so many apocalyptic films where part of the weird, perverse joy that we get out of it is seeing what our civilization looks like when everybody's gone and the cities are empty or overgrown. And this early 1920s French film is a weird little movie about a group of people who are left awake when a mad scientist basically puts everybody to sleep in Paris. And they have the entire city to themselves, but they also have to figure out a way to save everybody. It's one of the earliest, possibly the earliest empty city movie to really establish that kind of idea that then becomes such a linchpin in certainly modern zombie films. And it's easy enough to find online these days, which is great. Your fan out there really wants to fill in their historical knowledge. More so than ever, you can pop on YouTube or archive.org and find a lot of these public domain old movies and see where everything started from.
On one level, I want to call your book scholarly, but I know that has such a bad kind of connotation to it. But it's scholarly in the sense like you go into depth, it's well researched, it's well detailed, and I enjoy the fact that you end your chapters with these lovely food for thought with little zombies munching on brains questions. But what I also want to make sure people understand is that while it's scholarly in content, your approach to it is very accessible and just loads of fun.
Well, thank you so much. I have to say it wasn't easy. It was a very difficult thing, but it was a challenge I wanted to set where I wanted to make a book that on one level I could hand to other people in the world of education, not just college, but younger as well, and say, here's something you could conceivably use to bring this into your own classroom. And that's where the idea of ending the chapters with some of those call-outs, that was the idea of, well, I could actually give you prompts for further discussion, for even writing assignments, something that could give you some context in a class, because all these years I've gotten so many emails and phone calls from people saying, well, can I see your syllabus, and can you tell me more about how you set this up, and I'm teaching this next semester and I don't know what to do. And I thought, well, that would be one great thing, is here's a book that you could use yourself or use in a classroom and bring this experience in. But then I thought to myself, the kind of person I am, I wouldn't want the book to be dry and boring. I still want a zombie fan to be able to pick it up and go, this is great. It's a celebration of everything I've ever loved, and I might even learn a thing or two even I didn't know. And so the tone was important. So it's very gratifying to know that worked, and at least for you, you see the balance there, and I really appreciate it.
Well, I want to pose to you one of your food for thought questions, just because it's one that, although I've made the connection between zombies and Frankenstein's monster, you pose a really nice question, which is to look to the similarities and differences with the Seabrook's description of zombies and Mary Shelley's description of Frankenstein's monster.
Mm-hmm.
What do you point out about that?
Well, one of the things that comes up, there's also a whole lot of footnotes in this book. One of the things I always loved about books with footnotes is that they can tend to be daunting and, like you say, scholarly in a bad way. And you think, oh, no, I don't want to go through this. But what I always liked is the idea that footnotes not only give you the opportunity to use them in a more academic way, but they can also be a fun way to hide additional information throughout the book and say, oh, by the way, there's a little gem here. If you hop over to the back, I'll say something a little extra about this.
That's academic Easter eggs.
Exactly. That's right. That's exactly right. So one of the parallels that did come up, and that does come up in the book, is the idea that Shelley did something very similar in the novel to what Seabrook does in Magic Island when he describes his actual meeting with a zombie. And in both cases, Seabrook's meeting with a zombie and Dr. Frankenstein's first observation of his living monster, or creature, depending on how you look at it, both of them use descriptions that reflect the concept of the uncanny valley, this idea that we've had around for quite a long time now, that human beings are sort of hardwired when confronted with a figure or an object that seems to mimic humanity and yet doesn't quite get all the way there. We tend to have a very visceral reaction of revulsion or alarm or fright to something that looks human but clearly isn't. Very often people will describe, for instance, how when you see poorly done CGI characters, they might look real, but there's something dead in their eyes. Like we can't get the eyes, and it ties neatly into the old poetry about the eyes being the windows to the soul. And, of course, that's getting better these days. But in both the description of the monster and description of zombies, you often get these references to there's nothing in their eyes. You get a chill because you can't see anything in there that's alive. And so there's an interesting connection there.
Well, the other reason I ask that is that I've had the opportunity to attend panels at Comic-Con and WonderCon by the Legal Geeks. I don't know if you're familiar with them. But,
oh, yeah.
So they did one panel on not guilty by reason of zombification and one panel on whether it was a hearing about whether or not Frankenstein's monster could be held responsible for the murder of little Maria. And so both of these kind of courtroom cases deal with this idea of, consciousness and like the sentient qualities of these creatures or these beings. And with the trial of Frankenstein's monster, it was just really interesting to hear the audience ask questions and the panel, present questions, and this sense of, is Dr. Frankenstein the one who's responsible for this creature because he created them? And then how old is the creature? Is he as old as his body parts, or is he as old as the amount of days he's been reanimated? And there are a lot of really interesting questions which I think kind of play into the whole zombie context too. What are these creatures really responsible for what they're doing? Are they completely mindless? Do they have any consciousness of what it is that they're doing? That's part of what makes them so interesting.
And I think it's interesting, too, because that kind of ties back to one of the times you and I have talked before where we really focused on the sentient zombie.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Something we both have, been paying a lot of attention to in recent years, that version of it. It's also interesting, though, that you bring that up because I think this is a perfect example of how the kind of prompts in the book, it's like a first test case here that shows these really work well, because I wouldn't have thought of that because you had the experience of that panel. And yet you bring up the question, and it provided a connection to that memory and the things that you heard them talking about. And there's a perfect example of how even things like prompts, I might have something in mind that I thought, well, here's a theme or an idea that we just discussed in that chapter that might provide additional conversation. But the beauty of it, and the reason why classes using this kind of material work so well, is you have a room full of people that all have different backgrounds and different life experiences. And the whole point of media criticism, media literacy, is you bring yourself to all those experiences every time you watch something or you experience something. There's no way of knowing where that conversation may go. And one of the things I think I even say in the book is I learned a lot of things from my students that I would never have thought of independently, but they brought their own perspective to it. And suddenly I was now able to benefit from that and say, well, I never would have interpreted it that way, but I can totally see where you get that from. And so you really have an enormous opportunity to expand your perspective on things when you start to have conversations like that.
Well, and I want to ask you just one more of your food for thought questions here because I really like them. I really like them. They're great. So your other question is, in voodoo, it takes the actions of a human to make another human inhuman. So what does that say about personal responsibility in othering someone? That's such a great kind of prompt.
Yeah, well, that one came about. Natalie Lutovsky, who's my wife, and also she pops up in the book a couple places. She actually suggested that particular question, and it's very apropos to the current climate. I think, as we were talking about before, we're at a pretty difficult and at times very troubling time where not only are we still struggling with many of the same issues that you could argue, like the classic movie like Night of the Living Dead was struggling with 50 years ago. But not only have we not made a lot of headway, but it seems like the voices of the negative side have become louder and more emboldened. And this notion that we can so easily lack empathy for fellow human beings simply by color of skin or difference in nationality is so alarming. And so the idea of looking at the zombie, and particularly the early voodoo traditions of the zombie, and the idea that one has to take responsibility for othering someone and for putting someone into a predetermined category that denies them rights or that changes their life or that, robs them of any individuality or free will is hugely profound. And I think that, like many of the questions there, the goal is, well, it could certainly spark a discussion about current events. You could tie it to something that's actually happening in the news and say, who do you think is responsible in this situation for what's happening here between these people? And there it is right there in the early days of the zombie genre is something that gives us an opportunity to look through that lens at 2018 and talk about it in a meaningful way.
And going towards kind of the historical elements that you bring in, you also point out this Article 249 that not everyone may be familiar with, but it's something in the Haitian Criminal Code about addressing the criminality of creating a zombie.
That's right. Yeah, it's something that's referenced in Seabrook's book, and it's called Article 249, even though technically that's incorrect. That was another thing, too, is that throughout the development of the book, there were a few things that came up where I would hit like a subject and think it didn't really feel like it fit like within the ongoing narrative. And just as a book designer, because the other thing, too, that may not come up very often is I also did all the design of this book. So it was a labor of love on many levels. The cover was done by Lauren Moran, who's just a stunning artist, but I've been working on what I wanted the book to look like and how to structure it as much as writing it, and so the design of all of it was something I was very focused on. And I've always loved sidebars. I've always loved the idea of a book where you dive in and there feels like so much that you can explore and that there are different directions you can go in and you can find your own path through a book. So there were a number of times where things didn't feel like they fit within the narrative, and I just gave them a sidebar, and Article 249 was a perfect example of that. And I threw in, for instance, an image that actually was used in the promotion for White Zombie in 1932, where they were encouraging theaters to put up large displays of the penal code from Haiti and show people, here's Article 249. And it's actually Article 246, but it's actually on the books about the criminality of attempting to create a prolonged state of lethargy or cause the death of or zombify somebody. And it is a legal situation that's actually dealing with sort of the real-world impact of that there, but it quickly grew into something far beyond that because it was used as a means of convincing people, see, this horrible, frightening thing is real, and they even have to make a law about it. And to this day, there are people that still refer to Article 249, which was the misidentified version of it.
Before we leave these voodoo zombies, I just want to mention what the film that's my absolute favorite of these, which is I Walked with a Zombie, which is so visually striking. And there's even moments where you get this real sense of kind of the meaning of these zombies within that culture, even though, it's a film made in Hollywood, by, mostly white filmmakers. And yet there's occasional scenes that kind of touch upon the roots of where this voodoo zombieism comes from that were quite powerful. Yeah,
I think it's interesting. I mean, there's stuff about that movie that's fascinating in that, and this happens a lot in any kind of media where you start to explore media that attempts to be mindful of something but is still of a time. It's like there's that weird paradox where there are elements of it that are very sort of aware of the infantilization of a culture and the way in which the white people there clearly are not really understanding or appreciating the independence or the traditions of the locals. And yet at the same time, the movie is also doing the same thing. So it's a bit of a paradox, but it's such a beautiful movie. It's so poetic. It has some of the truly great, like dramatic and horrific moments just accomplished with light and shadow. And of course, it's Val Lewton producing and Jacques Tourneur directing. And I think everybody points to things like the scene where Sir Lancelot is singing the song and just kind of emerges out of the shadows at her.
The wife and the brother, they want to go, but the Holland man, he tell them no. The wife fall down and the evil came, and it burned her mind in the fever flame.
Wes, we must get back to Fort Holland.
Shame and sorrow for the family. Her eyes are empty and she cannot talk, and the nurse has come to make her walk. The brothers are lonely and the nurse is young, and now you must see that my song is sung. Woe ah me, shame and sorrow for the family. Woe ah me, shame and sorrow for the family.
But one of my favorite moments is Teresa Harris, who was a black actress then, who played throughout her career, just played tons and tons of maids and servants, and she's Alma in that. And she has one of my favorite line readings in the movie where she tries to convince Betsy, our lead character, that maybe the real medical solution is to go find better doctors at the home fort and consult a voodoo priest. And she's describing it to her, and it's getting dark and mysterious, and Betsy is clearly uncomfortable. And at the end of it, Alma just leans in and goes, "Better doctors." And it's creepy, and yet not at the same time, because she's clearly totally in awe of and respectful of what they can do. It's not meant to be frightening. She thinks it's wonderful. but she just delivers that with just the right mix of like joy and horror, and I just love that moment.
In researching the book and putting it together, did you uncover any films that really inspired you in the sense that you hadn't gotten to explore them completely before, or that popped out of nowhere or something?
Well, a lot of putting this book together was sort of a natural progression from working on Zombie Mania years earlier. And in many respects, some of the most, well, it was twofold. Some of the most research I wound up having to do was largely about things that had happened since Zombie Mania, some of the more recent work that I hadn't delved into with the same degree of attention to detail as I had everything that had come before. So that meant anything post-2005 or so, I was really looking at, I mean, I've seen plenty of it, but I was looking at it with fresh eyes and trying to look at it more from the context of, okay, what does this mean culturally, historically? How can we fit this into this narrative that's running through the whole book? But still, there were things that came up, whether it was release dates that were different than everyone used to think, or occasional movies from different decades that were never really that prominent, that did pop up. But if I had one thing that I can think of that's very different between Zombie Mania and this, there was something that came up that I was very keen to get in there. It's Mexican mummy movies. And there's this sort of side thread. There are so many things in the zombie genre that I'm very all-inclusive, as the book really argues throughout. I like to include a wide variety of creatures that have sort of fallen under the umbrella of the zombie, including, like we said before, the zompires, these creatures that very much can often be interpreted as both. There's also an entire run of Chinese and Asian stories involving the hopping corpse characters, which also are very vampiric, but have sort of been adopted into the zombie family pop culturally. But after finishing Zombie Mania, I discovered this one guy, Keith Rainville, who had done a short run of a book called Zombie Mexicano. And it was like a self-published book, and there wasn't a lot of attention to it, but I just happened upon it. And he, in his book, presents this very passionate argument that among all the different trends of zombie movies over the years, including all the Italian movies that we all know so well, one of the cultures that everyone seemed to overlook was Mexico, and that in the 1970s there was a run of Mexican mummy movies that were based on these historic momia, these mummies that were actually real and uncovered in these tombs, and they really are zombies. And the fact that many of us in the zombie community tend to separate the mummy out, the point is that unlike the Egyptian mummy, which is this carefully prepared, emptied, wrapped corpse, the Mexican mummies are just desiccated corpses that were allowed to mummify on their own. In other words, they're as close to really being a zombie as anything else we see in any of the other films. I looked at his book, and I thought, if there's one thing I got to do one day when I do another book about the history of zombies, it's give them their just due where they belong in the chronology. So at a couple points in the book, I made sure to incorporate some references and even a picture from one of these zombie movies. And I definitely want to get in touch with Mr. Rainville, because I want to tell him that, at least you reach somebody with your argument, and I think it's valid, and I wanted to make sure it was in there.
You said those were from the 70s. I want to go back a little bit in time to your chapter on the 1950s with Zombies from Another World. So, again, we tend to focus on Romero's zombies, which we've gotten used to kind of seeing the social criticism that's embedded in those. But these from the 50s have a slightly different spin to them. And what makes them unique?
Well, one of the things about the 50s, and that actually is another thing that I was very personally passionate about in making this book, is that I spent about 20 years in the comics industry before all this, and was very steeped in comics history, and I still am, and still do to the extent that I can things about comics and superheroes, and like you mentioned, Marvel. And one of the things that I always loved was the story of the 1950s experience of American comics and the Senate subcommittee investigations and everything that grew out of EC Comics, the horror books that sparked this massive wave of censorship and might have collapsed an entire industry. And what's interesting is that even I was guilty in the past of kind of skipping over just how important the comic book world played a role in the development of the pop culture zombie in the 50s, because as we sort of cross from the voodoo era and get things ready for when Romero's zombie is going to show up, there's this period of time where zombies take a variety of different paths, and comic books turn out to be where a lot of the more familiar elements of the modern zombie are developed. So in the 50s chapter, you get a reprint, actually, of a piece that I had done for another book that's split up in this book in a couple places where it's relevant, that gives you the background on that. And then on top of that, you've got the 50s obsession in this country with the awareness of our responsibility for and fear of atomic power, the fear of potential communist invasion and infiltration of American culture, and the very real attempt by American propagandists to convince people that suburban home life was this perfect paradise where everybody knew their roles and everybody sticks to them. And in that world, you have a few very significant movies that incorporate the idea of corpses coming back as puppets, this time not by voodoo, but by alien intervention. And some of these creatures are very familiar from the perspective of modern zombie fans, but they're not quite there yet. And it's sort of a fascinating decade to look at from that perspective.
Well, and the other film you mentioned in that chapter that I had never really thought of within the zombie universe is The Invasion of the Body Snatchers. But
right.
Once I saw that mention, I was going like, it's just like more functional zombies where, they can speak.
Well,
but they're not in control. They no longer have their free will, which is the terrifying thing for me about zombies.
Yeah, and it's one of the things I bring up in order to show that there are lines that I will definitely hold to. So, for instance, in terms of the body snatcher stuff, it's hugely important thematically,
mm-hmm.
and it's probably one of the most potent movies of that era in terms of delving into all these themes you were just talking about. And yet, I would say this is a line I draw where the pod people of Body Snatchers are not zombies. They're not zombies by any criteria that I would use to qualify them, because for all the things that they have as similarities, the point that I consider as key is that a zombie ultimately has to be a human being who is either a dead person risen by some means or a living person controlled by some means. And in the case of the body snatchers, these are alien duplicates that have grown out of those alien plants to replace the original humans they used as a template. So in other words, the pod person technically is not that original person's body.
Mm-hmm.
It's a duplicate.
They're like huge seed pods.
This must be the way that body in my closet was formed. Miles, where do they come from?
I don't know. But if they are seeds or seed pods, they must grow someplace on a plant, probably. And somebody or something wants this duplication to take place.
But when they're finished, what happens to our bodies?
I don't know. When the process is completed, probably the original is destroyed or disintegrates.
Scott.
No, wait!
Sorry, but I take a dim view of watching my own destruction take place.
There isn't any danger until they're completely formed. We learned that last night at your house. Your blank didn't change right away.
Not until you fell asleep. Miles, when the change does take place, do you suppose there's any difference?
There must be. Wilma noticed it. So did little Jimmy.
So did I. My father.
That must be what he was doing in the cellar last night, placing one of these. I'm sorry.
I felt something was wrong, but I thought it was me because I'd been away for so long. They have to be destroyed. All of them.
They will be. Every one of them. Listen, we're going to have to search every building, every house in town. Men, women, and children are going to have to be examined. We've got some phoning to do.
Well, I'm going to stay right here where I can watch them.
I'm going to stay with you.
And don't call the police! Nick Rivet didn't find any body on a burning haystack.
And so I draw that fine line. And yet, given that I have to fight somebody about 28 days later, like at least once every other week, I'm willing to leave the door open. So if anybody wants to say pod people are zombies too, it's like, well, there's plenty of reason to say that that's true, and I'm not gonna stop them from feeling that way.
The thing about it is just the fact that you mentioned them within the context of the zombie just made me look at it a little differently. And the thing that's most terrifying to me about zombies is this idea of loss of identity. And so to me, the connection I see between the zombies and the pod people is that sense of loss of identity. Different context,
sure.
But that the thing that both of those hone in on, the thing that scares me is that creepy sense of like being you but not being you.
Yeah, and I mean, the thing is, even as we're talking about it, I'm thinking, might have to rethink this at some point in the future. Because the other thing, too, is you could argue, well, when the duplicate comes out the other side and comes out of the pod and takes over the life of that human being, has it actually brought any of that human's consciousness over to that duplicate body with it? Mm-hmm. Because then you've got the same sort of philosophical dilemma that you have with some zombie stories where you could say, is it possible that somewhere inside that seemingly empty vessel there is a consciousness that's trapped in a prison? And that brings up all other questions about whether you could truly look at the zombie as a target or as an enemy. And I guess you could say the same thing about the pod people, too. It's like we don't know 100%. And so the question is there a human trapped in there somewhere? I agree with you. It's like one of the creepiest aspects of the whole thing is the loss of identity, the loss of self.
Well, now that discussing it in those terms, it makes me think of also in Get Out, the characters where they seem to be existing in this being where they don't seem to remember their past, but then they have those flashes where they suddenly link back to some real memory that they have. And again, it's that sense of, that loss of control, loss of free will that is one of the most terrifying things that zombie movies bring up for me.
And that's one of the main reasons why, I mean, not least because Get Out's one of the most significant events in the horror genre of the last, 10, 20 years, that I included some of Jordan Peele's own commentary about Night of the Living Dead in the book, because he draws a direct line between Night and Get Out, and many other people were already picking up on that. And since Night of the Living Dead's status as such an important social commentary is so hugely connected to the racial factor, it's fascinating to look at where we are 50 years later, and here comes Jordan Peele with Get Out. And I've already seen so many places that are doing double features where they're screening Night of the Living Dead and Get Out together as this wonderful half-century pair that comments on race two different times in American history.
Well, to wrap up this conversation, because I could talk to you for hours about zombies, but to wrap this up...
We'll do it again sometime.
To wrap this up, I'm just wondering, what are some of the upcoming or recent zombie films that are striking your fancy or that are signaling to you that maybe the genre's going in different directions or interesting trends?
Well, it's interesting. I hate to say it. I mean, it could change tomorrow. I haven't seen a lot of things pop up lately that I felt are necessarily game-changing, or like a few years ago when we started seeing all the stuff like we were talking about another time, like Warm Bodies and In the Flesh from the BBC and iZombie and all that. We were talking about the rise of the sentient zombie. I haven't necessarily seen a lot of things lately, either just out or coming, that are changing the course of things. But I have certainly seen some things come out that show that there's a lot of vitality left in a genre that people still very often feel obliged to write clickbait articles about how it's dying, because that's how they get their visitors, I guess. But everything from like Cargo that came out last year with Martin Freeman, which was an expansion of a short piece that was very effective. There's an upcoming movie that looks, it's hard to say how good it will be, and it looks very intriguing as far as the sentient zombie angle, with Matt Smith and Stanley Tucci as a sort of thinking zombie leader of a zombie revolution. It's called Patient Zero. And I'm seeing things like that where it may not be that anything right now is a huge change, but I see people playing with variations on a theme and trying to find ways to do it that show that there's still, ironically enough, life in it. Another one that I've heard good things about but have not yet seen is Anna and the Apocalypse, which apparently did a very good run at festivals and is finally starting to come out more widely this December. And it's a Christmas zombie movie musical.
Oh, my. I'm intrigued.
And it looks delightful, and I hope that it lives up to all the hype and the positivity, because people are comparing it to Shaun of the Dead and a number of other things. And I'm hoping that that'll be the case, because that could certainly be something that would stand as one of our more unique examples of the genre from recent years.
Well, in one film I saw recently, which is, I think it ventures into the 28 Days Later infected people kind of thing, is The Girl with All the Gifts.
Oh, yes, absolutely.
Which was really, like, again, it was one of those films I went into going like, are they really going to be able to find something new? Because I saw the trailer and I thought, okay, it's these fast-moving zombies and there's lots of like CGI blood. And that one totally engaged me.
Yeah, based on a book. And it seems like a lot of things now, not just zombies, but a lot of stuff. It seems like a lot of some of the best storytelling is growing out of like YA books and that entire subgenre of modern literature, where it's actually just drawing out so many interesting character studies and character-driven stories. And Girl with All the Gifts sounded like a really, really inventive flip of the usual expectations.
So is there one film you're most looking forward to?
Well, I guess Anna and the Apocalypse right now is the one I'm most looking forward to. I've been hearing about that for so long, and I finally saw like the full trailer that they shared online.
'Twas the night before Christmas, and all through the house, not a creature was stirring, not even a mouse. Young Anna was nestled, all snug in her bed, not knowing tomorrow she'd meet the undead. How would she survive what this season would bring? Well, that's simple. She'd stab, she'd slash, and she'd sing. A time to be alive. What a time to be alive. What a time to be alive. What a time to be alive.
Oh no.
What?
Justin Bieber's a zombie.
And I'm really hoping that we have something that shows that when done well, which is a very tricky prospect, you can blend comedy and horror in an effective way rather than one in which one has to suffer, to the detriment of the other. And sometimes I feel that way about horror comedies, that sometimes only one of those can really work well and the other has to suffer. But Shaun of the Dead's a great example of that balance being just perfect.
Yes.
And I'm hoping that this one is too.
Well, and you also briefly noted In the Flesh, which is one of my favorite zombie incarnations recently. And that never finished, really, right? Because they never really finished the series.
Yeah, it ended on a cliffhanger, and Dominic Mitchell, who created it, has still occasionally made some noise about, day would come, they'd like to do a wrap-up movie or something. But unlike here or maybe on Netflix where that could happen, it seems like as the years have gone by, that's become less and less likely.
Yeah.
And it's a real shame. That's one of those things where I tell people that it ends on a cliffhanger. I warn them in advance, but I still recommend it to everybody because the journey is so worth it no matter what.
Well, and you mentioned that balance of comedy and horror, and that show was so brilliant at having absolutely ridiculous, silly scenes. And then the next moment, something that was really horrifying, and horrifying in a very kind of real-world way.
Oh, absolutely. And some just beautiful, stark imagery. I mean, the idea of being in that, like, distant Welsh village, and everything is just slate gray and rain-washed. And it was the perfect environment to tell this story of, like, a whole group of alienated people who are trying to find their way. And it was beautifully done, design-wise, acting. It was a real gem, and I think it was one of the most unfairly overlooked shows in quite a long time. And I wish it would be given a chance to end on its own terms. But, who knows? It could still happen.
Just even just one episode to tie it all together.
Let's do it like so many of the British shows do. Do us an In the Flesh Christmas special and just wrap it all up.
There you go. Yeah, I highly urge people to check this out. It's about zombies in a world where they find a cure and are able to reintegrate them. And it brings up so many different issues in terms of them not being accepted, and then some of those like rehabilitated zombies think that they're God's chosen ones and form a cult, and then there's all this prejudice against them. There was just like so much going on. And yeah, I recommend that to anyone.
Oh, and by the way, since we're bringing that up and you were asking me about things I would recommend or things I want to see, there's a movie that came out last year that I haven't seen yet that's an Ellen Page movie called The Cured. And I had only seen a trailer for it. I still haven't seen the film, but it's a new zombie movie. But what I found kind of a bit disturbing about it was it looked like basically a complete ripoff of In the Flesh. And I'm very intrigued to see it because I want to see just how much it really is just a remake, or if somehow the trailer misrepresents what that movie winds up being.
I did get to see it, and it's not nearly as interesting or as layered as In the Flesh. And it does not have any of the sense of humor or satire kind of to it. It's got some like a couple of interesting elements, but not. It doesn't pan out nearly as well as In the Flesh. Well, I want to thank you very much for talking with me. And where can people find your book?
Well, right now, Journey of the Living Dead is available online through atbpublishing.com, and you can order it direct from ATB Publishing. We are going to be doing a physical launch of the book at Monster Mania in Hunt Valley, Maryland at the end of September, the weekend of September 28th to 30th. So if you're in that area, and you want to meet Robert Englund and Kane Hodder, who is Jason, and so many other people, and then also see me around there, we'll have books there. But otherwise, you can find it online. And people can also find me on Twitter at Dr. the Dead, where I'll certainly keep people posted on any other availability or events that we're doing.
Well, thanks a lot. It's always so much fun to talk to you about raising the dead and having our annual checkup.
It's a pleasure. I love our annual Halloween checkup.
Doctor of the Dead, Arnold T. Blumberg. I always enjoy speaking to him about zombies. And if you enjoyed this conversation, then check out our earlier discussions. There's episode 59, all about the self-aware zombie, or episode 96, about zombies for humanity. The Cinema Junkie podcast comes out every other Friday. If you enjoy the show, please tell a friend. Till our next Film Fix, I'm Beth Accomando, your resident Cinema Junkie.
KPBS On Demand is supported by Paint Care, offering households and businesses in California more than 800 leftover paint drop-off sites for recycling. Quantities of 100-plus gallons of paint may qualify for a large volume pickup. Learn more at paintcare.org.